All right, I want to start with a simple question. When you ask an AI chatbot something and it gives you an answer, is that answer speech? Because if it is, that has huge consequences in terms of how the First Amendment applies. And that's exactly what a new federal lawsuit is all about. So here's the situation. A company called xAI, founded by Elon Musk and the one behind the chatbot called Grok, has sued the state of Colorado. They're challenging a controversial AI law known as Senate Bill 24-205. It was enacted in 2024, but after several delays, it's now set to take effect on June 30th of this year. Now, on its face, this law is about something called algorithmic discrimination. Basically, it's trying to prevent AI systems from producing unfair outcomes, like biased decisions in hiring, lending, housing, things like that. In a first glance, that sounds pretty reasonable because who wants AI going around discriminating against people? But xAI says the law does something much bigger than that. They argue that it forces AI companies to shape what their systems say to match the government's views on issues like fairness and equality. And if that's true, which I think it is, this law is squarely in First Amendment territory. To understand this argument, you have to zoom out first, just a second. What is an AI system, legally speaking? Well, xAI says that it's not just a tool, it's a kind of expressive system. Because building an AI model involves a ton of choices, like what data you should train it on, what counts as a good answer, and whether responses should be blunt and factual or careful and politically sensitive. Yeah, those are technical decisions in terms of coding, but they also reflect values and editorial discretion. The complaint basically says designing an AI system is like running a newspaper or curating a social media feed. Courts have already said those kinds of decisions are protected speech. So xAI's position is if those are speech, then AI outputs and the choices behind them are speech as well. Now here's where the legal issue kicks in. The First Amendment doesn't just protect your right to speak, it also protects your right not to speak. The government generally can't force you to say something that you disagree with or otherwise wouldn't say. That's called compelled speech. And xAI says that's exactly what this law does. Because to comply with Colorado's rules, companies might have to do things like retrain their models, adjust how answers are generated, or add filters or guardrails that weren't there before. In other words, they'd have to change what their AI says. The complaint puts it pretty starkly. It says the law would force their chatbots to conform to a politicized viewpoint chosen by the state. It gets even more interesting. The law defines algorithmic discrimination in a very specific way. It bans certain kinds of unequal outcomes, but it allows others. For example, it explicitly allows outcomes that are meant to increase diversity or address historical discrimination. So not all disparities are treated the same under the law. And xAI argues that means the government is picking a side in a broader debate about equality and fairness. In First Amendment law, that's called viewpoint discrimination, and it's basically the most disfavored kind of speech regulation out there. Because the government is both regulating speech and favoring one perspective over another. Now, a lot of this law is directed at AI developers, but there's another piece to this argument, and it involves you. The First Amendment also protects your right to receive information. So if the government forces AI systems to filter or reshape their answers, that changes what users actually get. xAI says the result would be something like government-approved, sanitized outputs, meaning less controversial answers, less candid analysis, maybe even less inaccurate information depending on how the system is adjusted. So the claim is this law affects how AI is built and it affects what people are allowed to hear. Now, stepping back once again, this case is really about something bigger. AI is quickly becoming one of the main ways people learn things, ask questions, communicate, and make decisions. The complaint actually compares it to a printing press or the internet, but potentially even more powerful. So if governments can control how AI systems are designed, they'll be able to influence how information itself is presented and even what counts as truth. That's the concern driving this lawsuit. Right now, xAI is asking the court to block the law before it takes effect. And this case could end up being really, really important because courts are going to have to answer questions like whether AI generated speech is protected, whether design choices are expressive, and how far the government can go in terms of regulating outputs. There's not a lot of precedent here, so whatever happens could shape how the First Amendment applies to AI for the years to come. At the end of the day, this case is about control. Control over technology, but also control over information. Because if AI becomes one of the main ways we understand the world, then the question becomes who gets to decide what it says. And that's a debate we're just getting started on.